Good to go? Awesome. All right, well, thank you guys for coming. There are a lot of really cool panels and talks here at the same time as this, so thanks for coming and seeing this Alaska, Texas boy come and chat with you a little bit. My name is Marc Cameron. I write the Jericho Quinn thrillers, the Arliss Cutter mysteries, and also the last 7 of the Tom Clancy Jack Ryan novels. My 7th and last comes out next week, maybe, or 2 weeks, I can't remember. But it comes out pretty soon, and that will be my last time stepping away to focus more on the Arliss Cutter novels. I live in Alaska. I was a Deputy United States Marshal for about 22 years. Before that, I was a police officer. I don't have a big slideshow for you. In fact, I don't have any slideshow for you. Being a former federal government employee, I pretty much lived through all kinds of PowerPoint hell, and so I would rather just chat with you. And since I was here last year and actually recognize a few faces, I don't want to belabor the point or go over things that we talked about last year, because a lot of times, I kind of changed it. I edited. What did I do here? I edited my little slideshow thing to writing the propulsive thriller instead of writing a great thriller, I think is what it is. That's like saying, come to my class, how to earn $1 million. There's a lot of ways to earn $1 million. There's a lot of ways to write a propulsive or a good thriller. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experience. Now, when I was 9, I lived a very feral childhood. I was fortunate in many ways because writers have to go through we have to have a lot of angst. We have to have a lot of trauma, all that kind of thing, right? And I was fortunate to live a very feral childhood, and we were actually quite poor. But that poverty, we raised okra, and my dad was a teacher, and we lived in north central Texas or central Texas part of the time, and we sold okra and crookneck yellow squash to Safeway. And you don't make a lot of money raising okra, but we lived on this little farm, and I got to travel the farm and by myself at 9 years old with my bow and arrow and my dog and fish and hunt and spend a lot of time out by myself thinking and writing stories. And I read Where the Red Fern Grows when I was 8 and decided right then I want to be a novelist. So my mom was from Louisiana, and every summer we would make this trek to Louisiana where my mom's family was from and kind of get off the farm, not have to pick so much okra. But my sister and I were close to the same age, and my sister didn't like to play outside. And my aunts, their only toy in their house was a snow globe from some place in Louisiana, but it was a really boring toy. And so I had to go out and entertain myself. Or I sat on the porch with my aunts, and I learned how to entertain myself by listening to these stories and maybe tell some stories of my own, because there was 3 aunts that lived nearby. Now, that summer that I was 9, we went before that, but I don't have any clear recollections of it. That summer that was 9, I was playing out in the piney woods and the sassafras, and I got a tick in my belly button. Well, as I said, I'd grown up in Texas, and we have ticks and stuff like that, but I'd never gotten one. I saw them on a cow, and I saw a couple on my dog, but somehow, I don't know how I escaped it, but that summer, I was in the bathtub, and I got a tick in my belly button. And at first I didn't know what it was, but I didn't tell anybody, because, it was my belly button, and these people were old. And I was sitting on the porch, and usually I would sit and eat on a chicken leg or some cornbread or something like that. And the old women, the aunts, and my mom and my grandmother would shell peas, purple hull cow peas. And so they would sit and talk and tell stories, and I would eat a chicken leg and listen. And the stories were usually about somebody that died or somebody that got sick, or that particular summer, it was about the little Horton boy down the road who got a tick, and they pulled it out, and they left the head, and the Horton boy died. And I remember sitting there just terrified. And so I did what any 9-year-old boy would do who had a tick in his belly button, and I kept it to myself. Because I didn't want them to pull it out, and it didn't dawn on me that the head was in there whether the body was on it or not. And so I lived with this tick for a couple of days. Now, I sat and listened to these stories. I listened to stories about death and about Vietnam, about my grandmother, who would be my great-grandmother, who had been the mother of one of these aunts, and how she found the kids found a blasting cap, and they brought it to her because Camp Polk, Louisiana, was nearby, where the boys, as my aunts would call them, the boys would run maneuvers, and she brought the kids brought this blasting cap to my great-grandmother, and she picked at it with a needle until it blew up and blew 3 of her fingers off. So the whole time I knew my great-grandmother, she smoked a corncob pipe, but she did it with like the thumb and part of the left, what was left of her finger. These were fascinating people, and I remember watching them and listening to the way they told stories, listening to the way they kind of built that hook and built that arc. In fact, the way my aunt and I think my mom might have talked to them a bit about maybe toning down the death and destruction and cancer stories for her kids, because we were the only kids there. In fact, I'm not so sure we weren't the only kids for like 50 miles. There's never anybody to play with, just a lot of very old people. And so my Aunt Bessie, she would have been probably 75 or 80 at the time. She's probably 50, 10 years old, younger than I am now, but she seemed like she was 80 or 90. And she was shucking peas, and she looked up and she said, "Of course, you all know about the Horton boy who died of that tick." And of course, then she could tell us the rest of the story because we didn't know about it. She gave us that hook. So I learned the way that stories were told. And when people ask me, or when I do a talk about writing thrillers, or somebody says, "I don't know if I could be a writer." Can everybody be a writer? No, I see somebody shaking their head. I don't think they can. Now, I think that people that you can learn the craft, and you can write your own story, and that's great. So really, anybody can be a writer. Can anybody be a successful storyteller? I don't know. Can everybody be my oldest son's an ophthalmic surgeon. I have a tremor in my hand. I would hate to get cataract surgery from me. I will never be an ophthalmic surgeon. Never was. I was a good shot. It's not that bad a tremor, but I know my limitations. But I have talked to so many people here that I would say that probably most people can be a writer if they want to, and they put in the effort and they learn the craft. Here, there's so many good talks and panels and teachers that have learned about the business side of writing. But up here in the masterminds thing that I listened to, we all heard, I think, I was really pleased to hear somebody say, write the book first and then worry about the rest of it. You really have to know how to tell a story. So when somebody says, I don't know if I can write, I'll say, can you tell a joke? Can you tell a story? If you can tell a joke and you know when the punchline happens, if you know how to build that, and I'm talking more than a knock-knock joke, but if you know how to build that tension, then you can probably write. It's not ophthalmic surgery. It's not, rocket surgery, like my son says. And all of us have limitations, right? My wife, of course, she's got a son that's a doctor, right? So anytime that she's got an ailment, she calls him on FaceTime and shows herself to him on the iPad. And he says, Mom, that's body medicine. I don't know anything about body medicine. I don't deal with your eye. So she said, all right, well, look at this eye thing. So what I think when I think about thrillers, I think about hooks. I think about opening lines. I think I talked about this last year, didn't I? I talked about my favorite first line of all is the opening line from Charlotte's Web. It's, where's Papa going with that axe? Isn't that a great opening line? So I might work for days on an opening line of a book. Now, I heard a couple of the mastermind writers. I've chatted with some folks about whether we plot or pants. The picture's not up here now, but I add some pictures of things of me doing some research with the Marine Corps and some helicopters and V-22 Ospreys and flying in helicopters. That's cool. That's great research. I enjoyed it, and it allowed me to write a couple of the Tom Clancy books. I dove in the Arctic Ocean. I went in some caves, all kinds of stuff. But more of what I learned didn't go in the book than did, because you can really you can just oversaturate your reader. So, but in the center of all those was a picture of me in my living room by my fireplace, where I do a lot of writing, with like 15 giant Post-it notes with plot written on them. Sometimes you just have to sit down and write the book. There was another question where somebody said, do you write a clean first draft or a messy first draft? I write messy first drafts, but I plot and plot and plot and plot. So my first draft is really just a natural, it just flows naturally from all that plotting. But two things that I work on when I'm just free writing and sort of putting everything out there for the books, I work on my first sentence and I work on the ending. Because I believe that good thrillers, good mysteries, good romances have something called resonance. You know what I mean when I say that? So when you get to the end, you go, oh, that's familiar to me from the beginning. And so I have to know the end so I can write a good beginning. And we were talking, I can't see where you are, but we were talking earlier about how somebody was writing a post-apocalyptic stuff. And that's you, right? So post-apocalyptic stuff. If an apocalypse happened, my characters have failed. So I need for them to stop the bomb. So when I tell a story, I want to have a ticking time bomb. I don't want that bomb to go off. That ticking time bomb could be the metaphorical train with the damsel tied to the railroad tracks. And not to be sexist, because I like to write stories where the damsel frees herself sometimes, where she even saves the protagonist, if that, I generally write from a male POV. But many of you have or will meet my wife. She's the beautiful lady with the long silver hair. When we were coming through TSA on Sunday, the TSA lady stopped us and she said, please tell me that you guys love Christmas and do a Mr. and Mrs. Santa photo every year. And I said, we do. We absolutely do. But every female character in my books is my wife, whether it's the villain or the heroine or the ingenue or whatever. Somehow I've lived with her for 40 years and, throughout since we were 20, which is a long time. And so I can see bits and pieces of her. So I forgot where I was going with that. I get talking about my wife and it gets me all wacky. So I wanted to talk to you just a bit about those few things when it comes to writing thrillers. Working on that first line. I would tell you, go to a bookstore, go on Amazon, look at where it says, look inside, read, make it an assignment. I do it all the time. Read the first few lines of a book. There's a really good book by Noah Lukeman, a agent in New York. His name's Noah Lukeman, and he wrote a book called The First 5 Pages. Agents are so busy. Readers are so busy. What are we dealing with right now that competes for our readership? We're dealing with games, we're dealing with movies, we're dealing with all kinds of things that are just bombarding people to get them to not read our books. I have a friend who works in the gaming industry, and she's a 7-figure, always headhunted away. Every time I talk to her, she's working for a different company. Netflix will hire her, Amazon will hire her, this one Chinese company hired her to work on gaming. And we went on a research thing together. And I was chatting with her about AI and games and the state of the world. And she said, I won't even let my kids have smartphones. They just won't, because she said, my goal is to keep kids and adults, whoever, to keep viewers on that phone. We call it the compulsion loop. We want them to just scroll, to just go from reel to reel or page to page, whatever. So when I write, I don't want to sound quite that horrible, but when we write a book, that's what we want, is that compulsion loop. My best review that I can get, and I'm kind of known for not reading my reviews. I want reviews. I like getting reviews, and I'll go on Goodreads or Amazon or whatever and see that I'm getting reviews, but I refuse to go look at them. I think no good can come of it. It's like even if they're good reviews, it's like knowing your own IQ. What does that matter? Like, I'm super smart, or, oh man, I'm dumb, I didn't realize it. I remember my first Jericho Quinn book, I got 70, 80 5-star reviews. They didn't affect me. And I got one star. It gutted me for 2 weeks. And so I realized, what's the point, right? But my favorite email review that I ever got was a lady that said, I read your books through splayed fingers, and I'm always tired the next day because I couldn't put it down. So that's what we're looking for with a thriller, right? Thrillers, by definition, keep us amped, right? They keep us wondering. What the heck happened to that tick in your belly button, right? Are you ever going to tell us what happened? Well, what happened, and then I'd like to get some Q&A going, and rather than me direct where we talk, what happened is that I went to my mother, who's very quiet. In fact, most of my friends thought that she was mute when I was growing up. She's just a very quiet lady. And I told her about it, and she made the mistake of telling my Aunt Bessie, the lady that told us about the Horton boy. And at that time, it was late in the evening by the time I had the gumption to mention the tick. And we were all out, and our family had this thing where in the evenings, all the men and women would get together. They were very old, men and women, and they had these 2 picnic tables in the backyard, old wooden picnic tables. And they would cut watermelons in half on newspaper, and we would sit with, and this is Louisiana, and they eat watermelon with salt. And so they'd have salt shakers on the picnic tables, and everybody would have spoons, and we'd sit around together and talk and eat watermelon out of the same sloppy halves of these, watermelon carcasses. And I would listen, and my mother told Aunt Bessie, hey, Mark's got a tick in his belly button, what do we need to do? The men, who were all ranchers and heavy equipment guys and loggers, they swooped the watermelon carcasses off the table, and they threw me back like a human sacrifice. And I'm 9, right? So, and I don't think they held me down, but their eyes held me down. I mentioned that I have a trimmer. I inherited that from my Aunt Christine, and she had a cigarette in her hand, and she was going, let's burn it out. And, my Uncle Homer was going to spit tobacco in the middle of my belly button to try to get the tick out. And they had all these different, and the whole time Aunt Bessie is telling us about the Horton boy and how we got to get that tick head out. And I was bawling. My sister was probably crying because at that point I think that was one of the days she liked me. And they ended up, my mother said, how about we just put some fingernail polish on it and it back out, Wisdom prevailed, and I got rid of the tick and all of that. But that was a really trying time for me. It was thrilling, and I remember, so when I write a story, I think back. I think back how I felt as this young boy. In my head, I'm tied to the table, but I really wasn't. And how terrified I was. So I channel that. When I write a fight scene, I've kind of run out. I've got some law enforcement friends here. We all get together and tell our war stories. And I tell my friends that aren't in law enforcement, I say, if you've got a buddy who is a cop and he's got more than 9 war stories where he, no crap, I was there, he's probably borrowed other people's war stories. So by the time I get to and I don't know where I came up with 9, but that's all I have. So that's all I'm giving anybody else. And most of my war stories, I look silly. But when I'm writing a fight, when I'm writing a chase, I can look back on those war stories or stories I have known. So do you have to write what you know? No. I think, because otherwise, how could I ever write about CIA spies? How could I write about Stasi officers? How could I write about women. I could write about people of color. I could write about one of my main characters in the Arliss Cutter book is a Maori, Cook Island Maori woman from Rarotonga, where my wife and I visit. I know people that are that way. I can draw from them. I can draw from how they speak. I can interview them. I can chat. I can watch them. I contend that writers, all of us in this room, we're like the mollusks of the sea, right? We just sit there and we, this year we got this bigger notepad. Last year we got a smaller notepad, but my kids, I have probably 40 of these little Moleskine notepads, and I carry one around with me all the time. I hope that when my grandkids are older, or maybe my great-grandkids, they'll stumble on to this treasure trove of how I learned to tell time looking at the Big Dipper, how I learned to navigate sailing, they're my journals, but they're my notes when I talk to people. I remember, I might have told the story last year, but I remember being in a conference or a meeting with a bunch of Department of Justice bigwigs, and I was a chief deputy in Alaska for the Marshal Service, so the deputy director was there, and a bunch of bigwigs from Maine Justice, and several assistant directors, and they all knew I wrote. I think I had like 3 Jericho Quinns out at the time, and some Westerns. It was right before I retired. And so I'm sitting here with all these bigwigs, and some of them brought books for me to sign, right? So the attorneys hated that I was writing, but they couldn't stop me because I had a get-out-of-jail-free letter. And so I was signing the books, and they all knew that I carried this book around, and this like assistant attorney general from the Department of Justice said something really funny. And everybody, he's like the boss of the room, so they're like, ha, 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 ha. And I laughed, and then he looked at me and he goes, "What the hell, Mark?" And I said, "What?" And he goes, "Write that down. That was really good." I said, "Okay, all right." So a lot of little stories here, a lot of vignettes, but in the last 20 minutes or so, 23 minutes, is that 20 minutes till it's over? Okay, last 20 minutes, I want to be able to focus the conversation. I want you to leave this, though, thinking about that opening line, thinking about that hook. When I write for Boys Life, we learned that when you write for 13, 14, 15-year-old boys, if you don't write about poop or death, they're just not going to read the book. And I'm sorry to say, adults are kind of the same way. Are there any questions out there? Because I can keep being like a Peanuts cartoon adult and just wah, 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 wah. Would you come up to the mic, please?
So I am curious whether or not you have any, I want to say, genre conventions or tropes that you see more frequently or most frequently, and how you twist them, or if you twist them, or if you're even looking at conventions of like the thriller.
No, that's a really good question. So I write 3 series. I write the Arliss Cutter series, which is what I'm really focused on now, about a deputy marshal based in Alaska. I like to make law enforcement look good. Now and the same with the Clancy books. If I were to write, of course now I'm writing for the Clancys, I was writing for the estate. And so I'm writing for an icon. I mean, I read Clancy I read The Hunt for Red October when I was a rookie policeman. So I know over the course of my career what was going on with those books. But, the first World Trade Center bombing, I was protecting the judge and hauling Ramzi Youssef back and forth to court while I was reading The Sum of All Fears that had just come out in paperback. So I can remember that. So this was a big deal to me. So I wanted to do right by his characters, which meant that if I wrote about the military, they generally needed to be good. But, and I remember writing an early book and thinking and saying I was going to have this Secret Service person that was bad. And I got this note back that said, no, Tom Clancy would never do that. You got to be good. And up to that point, my wife and I had become Tom Clancy experts, and we chapter and versed. I'm like, well, what about this? What about that? What about that? And they were like, okay, do whatever you want. So yes, you do have to twist them a little bit, and I do want to have in an upcoming Arliss Cutter book, Arliss is going to go up head-to-head against a former friend in the Marshal Service that's kind of gone rogue, if you will. So you do have to twist them. But I would say that my biggest trope in the kind of books that I write, the good guys eventually win. And I would like for law enforcement, military, I like to, knowing that there's damaged goods out there, I like to highlight the good stuff. Hey, Jody. Thanks for making me feel relevant and asking a question.
You're very relevant. I wondered if you could, you said you were a plotter, and I am too. Can you talk a little bit about how you plot the suspense? Like, do you do that in the very beginning? Does it come to you? Like, how does that look for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I free write. I do a lot of free writing. I let it all hang out in the beginning, and I'll have, like, for a Clancy book that's got 7, 8 subplots, I'll have 8 or 9 yellow tablets just full of bleh. And out of that melange, I will divide that into scenes, and then oftentimes I'll take that because I'm trying to put off writing, I'll color code it and all kinds of stuff. And then when I finally get down to the writing, I will expand those scenes out. So I've got all these color coded by POV, and then I can take those scenes and something that I do, I turn in my manuscripts because I'm from the old typewriter days when I started doing short stories. I didn't get published until computer days, but I sent a lot in that way. So I like to write, and my editors like to read in Courier. This is probably too much inside baseball, but when I write my summaries, I write them in Times. So when I look at a manuscript, I can see all these Times New Roman synopses of all these scenes, and I know, oh, that's in Courier. I must have worked on that already, right? Because in a 130,000 word Clancy novel, it all just sort of comes at you in a million different directions. So, but because I do so many scenes, then if it doesn't snap and it doesn't propel me, I can move them around. And I do a lot of moving around. In fact, oftentimes, I would say more than 75% of the time, I write 3 or 4 chapters of the book and then get to the first sentence and say, all right, here we go. Were the first 3 chapters wasted? Not at all. I might use them later.
One of our online viewers would like to ask, for emotional resonance, is it important that crimes are punished and stories are neatly tied up? That
is a really good question, and I think that might have been one of my bad reviews, like, curse you, Marc Cameron. In the beginning, and I will tell you that one of my first editorial comments when I turned in a Jericho Quinn, so I'd written Westerns, and I got a note from my editor, and he said, I want you to think about this. I want you to start with a massacre and build from there. I said, okay, all right, and kill more people in the first chapter. I was like, okay, all right, you're paying the bills. I can figure this out. Well, I rewrote a chapter, and it was the only rewrite he had me do in the whole book, but I introduced this character who is a police officer in Colorado who had some burns on his face. He's former military, and he watches from this. It's kind of based on Castle Rock, so he's up on the rock, he's looking down at this mall, and he watches a mall explode because of terrorism, and his wife and one of his sons is at the mall, and so he's on the phone with him. Huge explosion, kind of akin to a World Trade Center thing. A lot of people are killed, and that starts the trajectory of the book and how Jericho gets involved and all of that, and it introduces the bad guys. Well, in my mind, because I'd written that after the whole book was written, that was a cool character. I showed his angst. I showed, oh, that's horrible that it happened. We know his wife and son probably died because everybody else did. And I went on with the main story. That book came out in 2011. I still get spanked because I didn't say what happened to that guy. His wife and son died, and he's now remarried and happily living in Boca. I don't know. I wanted to show what happened, how terrorism hurts everyone, and I stupidly thought that I tied that all up, but I think there is a lot to. In fact, my wife will often say, I don't have beta readers except for my wife. When she reads it, cleans it up, I rewrite it. 25 books, I've never not taken her advice. When she's cleaned it up and I rewrite it, I send it to my editor and we're done. Well, I say that, then a bunch of other editors get it. But by far, her most common criticism is, what happened to Jody? What happened to whoever, right? So I think it's very important. Lois, or Lolo, what do you prefer to be known here?
Either works.
Okay.
Okay, along the vein of when you mentioned writing what we know, which is a great jumping off point, we still have to do a lot of research, and last year you talked a lot about the research. And I'm wondering how you balance that so that you don't go into info dumps when you're, like, for example, if you were to tour the CIA museum and, you know, you're
Did
just
you get a tour?
No, I didn't,
Oh, okay.
but I was excited that you did.
Yeah.
But anyway, so when you're writing that and you're researching it out, so how do you balance that so as not to info dump the reader, yet at the same time you're excited about it and it's really neat, and how do you draw the line about what you think the reader would want to know about that?
That is an absolutely excellent question, and it's something I struggle with all the time. Often I give more than I should and then end up deleting a bunch of it. I tell newer, like the guy that was writing the Jack Ryan Juniors, and now Andrews and Wilson, who are writing they've taken over from me to write the Jack Ryan Seniors. I tell them, you go back and read all the Tom Clancy books, and then think about how they make you feel. Don't think about what he's written down. Think about how they make you feel, because as a new Clancy estate writer, our job is to make, and Craig mentioned it up here earlier, our job is to make the reader feel a certain way. If I were to write a Clancy book right now and spend a chapter talking about an electron going through the wires of an atomic device, people would TLDR. They would say, I'm not going to read a chapter of how a device like this works. Very few. He wrote for a wide audience and had a huge audience. But readership has changed. Readers have changed. He spent, without remorse, he spent a page and a half describing a K-bar knife, because nobody knew most people didn't know what a K-bar knife was. Now, the United States has been at war for 2 decades, and so that's disconcerting when that turns red, but awesome, good. So I have to now know that I can spend a little less time doing that. So when I do research, I get all the information I can, but the number one reason that I do research, well, there's 2 reasons. The number one reason is so I don't write what I don't know. Not write what I know, but I don't want to write something wrong. So if I write about a Glock and put a safety on it, all the police officers and weapons people here are going to go, yeah, you idiot, right? I am less, I see lots of arguments back and forth, and I think they're a little pedantic about whether you can call a revolver a pistol or not. Little things like that. Yes, it is not a pistol. I should say, no, it is not a pistol. Technically, I grew up in Texas where everything was a pistol. And you whacked a surly bartender with your pistol, which was a revolver. So I don't get too strung out about that. But I do want to make sure that I don't call a magazine a clip, and that I don't put a Glock, a safety on a Glock. I don't write about the CIA museum being at a separate facility than Langley, so that when I write it, I can write it for real. And the way I use the CIA museum, for those who don't know, that it's touted as the most interesting museum you'll never get to see, because you've got to have an in. You've got to know somebody to invite you in, and they do a background and all of that. So rather than going to an info dump, I set a scene in the CIA museum between John Clark and a young acolyte who he kind of is bringing on board. And so I can describe it, but so that there's some verisimilitude. When I write about Argentina, I'm writing about those unknowns that I figured out and I learned when I was over there. I didn't go over trying to learn that inflation was so bad that the taxi driver would say, inflation here goes up faster than the bubbles from a scuba diver's fart. But man, when he said that, I thought, that's going into a book, Bubba. That's the awesome stuff. So just, you got to be very judicious with that. Sir, thanks, Lois.
You mentioned that you do a lot of plotting beforehand, and you make notes on different yellow pads. How much time do you spend doing things like that before you actually start writing?
Yeah, that took far too much. I just love the process. I like to write longhand, and the way I get past that is I I divide all these scenes, and then many of those scenes in the free writing come out as a first draft because I love to write longhand. For the speakers, they gave us these really cool, Craig gave us these really cool pens here. I like a gel pen, I like a fountain pen. I order my pens from Japan, the cheapo gel writer pens. I'll get them by the gross. And I'll start on one of those scenes or segments, and it just gets fleshed out. And I would say that probably a third of any book that I write is written in longhand first, because it makes me break that. I can play around and, and move scenes around. Oh, this is exciting. And really, at some point, you just have to put your butt in a chair and write the book. And also, I have a wife that, I told you she is my first critic. And early on, she would say stuff, swat me on the butt and say, go write us a couch, go write us a chair, whatever. And as she learned that this was our primary bread, that this is our primary moneymaker, now she's very critical because this is our business. So she's like, this isn't working for me, Mark. And earlier it was like, how do you know so much about prostitutes and stuff like that? Yes, ma'am.
Continuing on the subject of the plotting, when you start, do you just start with, okay, I have an idea for a subplot, so I'm going to just start writing longhand, or do you actually sit down and kind of think, here's my beginning, here's my middle, here's my end, here's how I think I'm going to get to the middle, here's how I think I'm going to get to the end? How do you do that part? How early on do you know how you're going to get to the end?
When I'm free writing, it's almost as if you read I talk to myself. Here's what I think. Or maybe we could do this. Perhaps we could do this. Line through that. I have this conversation with myself. My wife bought me a Mont Blanc pen back when I made chief deputy of 20 years ago. And so I write with that same pen. I do a lot of just conversation back and forth with myself and work through my issues, and so the ending, I generally start with since I write character series, I will come up with a plot and then plunk and sometimes it's a place. I want to do a chase in Union Station in DC. How can I make a chase happen here? And so I approach it from all different directions, but I want to have that terrible plot hanging, ticking time bomb, plunk these characters down, and then have them react as I know they would. Got just a couple more minutes? Let's.
And you may have just answered that, but maybe if you wanted to elaborate, that'd be great. Because my question is, as a subset of that, how early on do you figure out what your ticking time bomb, your ticking clock is going to be? Can you move forward without knowing that?
No.
Okay.
That's got to be my first. That's a good question, though. Yes. 3 minutes and 43 seconds, ticking time bomb.
No pressure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
When you're considering your twists, when you're considering the twists, how much are you thinking about your antagonistic side or your villain when you're thinking about where those twists should come and how the reader is going to experience them?
That's a very good question, too. I do a lot of thinking because I write in a over-the-shoulder, third-person POV. So when I write, I don't write in first person, but I want the reader to feel like they're a camera and a microphone on the shoulder of whoever my POV character is that's plugged into their head. So the vernacular, even in my exposition, will sound. For instance, if I'm writing about somebody from a foreign country, I generally don't use contractions because I just think that's a way to signal to the reader, okay, this is someone else speaking here that's not speaking in English, but you're reading it in English. But I think a lot. I like that Stephen J. Cannell, what are the bad guys doing kind of a thing. So I like to hop back and forth. And my twists generally happen maybe every other book. I'll know, wow, this is going to be a delicious twist before I start. But other times they happen just kind of in a fun way as you're discovering. I mean, I plot very specifically and methodically, but they happen as I'm going along. And I remember writing about a character in one of the Clancys, 3 or 4 Clancys ago, and his mother is Azerbaijani, his father was Russian. He ends up in KGB. His mother was KGB also, but you start writing about these little things, and he's working in Iran for I say KGB, it's SVR, it's the new stuff, and he's, you want to write about the little things, and I wrote about him being assigned this really cruddy little car, and he's got to ride around Tehran, and he ends up becoming a mole. It's an older book, so if I wreck it for you, he becomes a mole in place asset for CIA, and his name's Eric Dovchenko. And so Dovchenko is, instead of describing what it's like to be a young SVR operative, I talk about this car, and I'm writing along thinking about it. I wasn't thinking about any cool little turns of phrases or whatnot, but he's Russian, he's in Iran, and he's got this sucky little car that's basically the size of a suitcase, and he calls it an axle of evil. And I thought, yeah, that works pretty good. And I think it was actually a misprint when I was writing it. So sometimes they just happen. We've only got 50 seconds. I appreciate you guys coming and talk. There's so much good going on here. I laud you for what you're doing. I had a young lady named Arliss Jacobs come up and chat with me yesterday. We had a little talk last year. From that talk, she finished a book, and she gave me the book, and it's really good. It's really good. I started reading it last night. Finishing something is a big deal. Just sitting down in that chair and writing something is a big deal. Congratulations to you guys for doing it. Thanks for coming.